Welcome to Grounded, Not Divided, a podcast about leaders who are getting important things done in the real world. I'm Matt Burgess. My guests on this show all have hard-won, real-world experiences. Experiences that shed light rather than heat on society's most vital issues. Today's episode is the third in what has become a three-part series on bright spots in K-12 education. In the previous two episodes, I talked to Karen Vates about the Southern Surge successes of Mississippi, Louisiana, Tennessee, and Alabama in K-12 reading, and I talked to Paul Bennett about Quebec's long-standing leadership in K-12 math. In today's episode, I talked to Shaka Mitchell about charter school success stories in the school choice debate in the United States. Shaka Mitchell has led high-performing charter school networks, including Rocket Ship Education and Lead Public Schools, serving over 2,500 students in Nashville. His students include some of the most disadvantaged in the city. He is a senior fellow at the American Federation for Children and an adjunct faculty member at Belmont University. We discuss the importance of school safety, high standards, building strong relationships between schools and families, and more. We also discuss Shaka's new initiative, the Come Together Music Project, which uses music to bridge political divides. Shaka Mitchell, welcome to Grounded, Not Divided.
Thanks so much, Matt. It's great to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you here. So I'm excited to talk to you about school choice and charter schools. And at the end, we'll talk about your new initiative around political polarization in music, which I just love. This is coming on the end of a series of episodes about K-12 and, what are the bright spots in K-12 that can really challenge the, I think, pretty defeatist narratives on both sides of the spectrum where, on one side, we hear messages that sound like we can't improve our K-12 outcomes unless we radically transform society in a, utopian egalitarian image. And on the other side, we sometimes hear messages that to me sound like, well, maybe some kids are just not that smart and we have to accept that. And I find both of those frustrating because there's so many bright spots where we are improving outcomes in K-12. And so this series is really about that. But before we get into the issues, tell me a little bit about yourself. Where did you grow up and how did you get involved in the education field?
Yeah, thanks, man. Well, I'll try to keep things brief. But I grew up on Long Island in New York and then went to high school in Georgia. I mentioned those two things because I really think for me, that's where kind of the seed was planted for some education policy and advocacy work. Where I lived in New York, we were in a very much a working class neighborhood with low performing public schools, unsafe schools, frankly. And so we went to Catholic schools, I and my siblings. And, these were not schools in Tony neighborhoods. This is just a lot of working class families that went to diocesan schools and got some financial aid support to go there. And so I did that and had a really good experience. And I think that those schools made a tremendous difference for me, for my siblings, especially compared to what I would see with, other friends who lived around the neighborhood. And then we moved and we went all the way to Georgia, and it was a total culture shock, as you might imagine, especially back then. And I went to a big public high school outside Atlanta, and I had a great experience there. And so I really think that's where the seed was planted to start thinking about, hey, how might education work better for all kids, right? Because my family was able to take advantage of the two oldest forms of school choice. One is to just pay for it out of pocket. The other one is to pay for U-Haul and move to a different neighborhood. And we did both of those. But what about families who aren't able to take advantage of either one of those options? Like, what do you do? And to me, it just, I didn't see that there were a lot of satisfying answers absent some kind of initiative and some kind of advocacy and reform. And so that really got me interested in education. And I've been really blessed to work in the space for now, 20, 25 years.
Cool. So before we move on, I just want to demystify school choice for our international audience. I grew up in Quebec and in Canada. If I say school choice, people like, does that mean the English versus the French board or the Catholic versus the Protestant board or whatever, right? It's sort of a different conversation. So as I understand it, school choice means basically more options besides the local public school that you're zoned into, and that those options can come from charter schools, to schools that are given a charter, and I think in many cases are free, although correct me if that's wrong. Vouchers for private schools, so we give families money and they can use it to attend private schools. Easier enrollment into non-neighborhood schools, so make it easier for families to choose whatever school in the district they think is best. And also easier access to non-traditional alternatives like homeschooling, religious schools, and other such things, Montessori schools, maybe. Mm-hmm. Have I missed anything?
No, I think you're getting it. A way, especially for international audiences, to maybe think about it, but frankly, even U.S. audiences to think about it, would be to say that that school choice, or really now educational choice, because it has expanded beyond just a building, right? It's really thinking about how to match the student with the education of best fit, sort of regardless of what system that's in. Might that be in the public school sort of government run system? Okay, great. But might it be in a faith-based system? Okay, fine. Might it be at home or in the online setting, some kind of hybrids? Sure. And interestingly, this is something that a place where the U.S. actually lags behind many other foreign countries. So in Europe, this is the norm, where you have students are funded sort of without regard to where their parents send them to school. The funding really follows the child, and then they go to the school that kind of meets their needs and again aligns with their family's values. But in the US, our school system, at least for the past 150 years or so, has tended to be based more on address and geography than anything else.
And Canada, I would say, is even further, if some of these European examples are on one side of the spectrum, Canada's maybe even further towards the side that you're suggesting the US is on, where, the idea that public schools is, the core of education is, I think, even more sacrosanct in Canada than it is here, which I think one of the things that makes me find this conversation really interesting. But one thing I just want to ask you as a follow-up question that your German example raises, which is really interesting, is it fair to say that the conversation about school choice is somewhat separate from the conversation about public versus private funding of schools, or do they end up kind of going together?
I think it's a good question. So at the American Federation for Children, where I'm a senior fellow, when we talk about school choice and when we are working on legislation and advocating for legislation that would pass programs that allow this, the reason we have to do this is because we're talking about the public, quote, public dollars following a child even to a private institution. So that's where I would say the kind of the intersection is. If you're talking about, as my family did, as I mentioned earlier, if you're talking about a private family making the personal decision to pay out of pocket for a private school, well, frankly, the government doesn't really have much to do with that entire transaction, right?
Right.
But if you're like me now as a father, I've got 3 daughters, and the school that they're zoned for isn't really a school that we love. It's not a great school academically. It's not one where we think that they would thrive. So
Sure.
The question is, as a taxpayer and as just a citizen, like as a taxpayer, we're paying into that system. Even if we weren't paying taxes, every state constitution in the United States says that public school has to be provided, right? So it is a state-based guarantee. So money is going to be spent for this for that setting. The problem is if the setting doesn't work well for our kids, then the question is, well, why are we even paying for it? Why don't we just send that money where it would work better? And that's kind of what's at the crux, I think, of school choice.
Gotcha. Okay, so tell me about the rocket ship education charter schools that you were involved in.
Yeah. I had the fortune to be the Tennessee director, the regional director for Tennessee for Rocket Ship Public Charter Schools, and Rocket Ship is a network of charter schools based in the San Jose, California area. It's elementary schools, and so there were a bunch of schools, maybe a dozen or so in the San Jose, which is just south of San Francisco area, and Rocket Ship was expanding to other places. It had a really innovative model at the time. It was doing a few things that hardly anybody else in the country was doing. So it was Rocket Ship was starting full scale schools, meaning many charter schools when they open, many new schools in general when they open, you might open with a one grade at a time, right? With a kindergarten and expand, through say fourth grade or fifth grade. Well, when we opened on day one, we would open with a full building, right? So 435 children, grades kindergarten through 4 or 5, whatever it was. And that was both really challenging. There's some scale benefits to doing that. Rocket Ship was also kind of ahead of the curve in terms of how it used technology pretty early on, and had learning labs for all students. So all students were on a personal device, and with using some adaptive learning curriculum for a small part of the day. It wasn't online all the time. So it was really kind of path breaking that way. Yeah, and so I got to be a part of that, and we opened 3 schools in Nashville, and a lot of really good memories. Opening schools is not for the faint of heart. It's a lot of hard work, a lot of hands in that work. So no one person does that, but I got to be a part of that team, and really glad I did.
So again, just a demystifying question for our international audience. A charter school gets its charter from whom, and from whom does it get its funding?
Yeah, good question. So a charter school is, if you think about a conventional public school as public funding, and the major decisions are set by a publicly elected school board. That's one end of the spectrum. A private school typically has been private pay and privately made decisions, right? A nonprofit board, a school board of trustees, or something like that. A charter school is somewhere in the middle. So it's public funds, but then a nonprofit board, usually it's a nonprofit board, goes to the school district and they get a charter from the district, right? And they say, so Shaka and Matthew want to open up the, Shaka and Matthew School of Art and Science. Okay, great. And we have this idea, and we create that plan and go to our local school district. We get a charter from them, and they say, okay, we're going to give you the seal of approval to open the school. Per this contract, you might have certain metrics you need to hit, academic metrics or other milestones. And then along with that, you're going to get some public funding, but it also means that as a public school, you're going to have some of the public regulations that come along with that.
Great. But correct me if I'm wrong, it's still the case that charter schools are somewhat more independent and therefore somewhat more able to experiment and specialize in certain things. And so often you see like charter schools, for science, like in the Denver area, or there's one in our area in Wyoming that, as I understand it, their thing is more traditional, strict discipline. Is that common, or I guess what I'm getting at in the context specifically of Rocket Ship is, what's the problem that you all were trying to solve, and or what was the experiment that you were trying to run? Does that make sense as a question?
Yeah, it does make sense. Yeah, I would say that that charters really presented an opportunity to be, I would say, more innovative, right? More innovative, more nimble than a district. I mean, again, thinking about where I live in Nashville, Tennessee, the Nashville district, you're talking about more than 150 schools, maybe 180 schools, 75,000 students. That's a big ship, right? You mentioned Denver. That's a big ship to try to steer. And it's really hard in a school district to do these one-off kind of experiments and do them and execute them with high fidelity. So now they're really good if you want to say, hey, we're going to do this. We're going to have this one new professional development session, and we're going to do it for all 6,000 of our teachers. And they send that out. Okay, well, that's fine. But what if they want to do something that's really kind of craft, right? Sort of a little more niche. And that's challenging. And so Rocket Ship, I would say part of the mission there was when we started, we were really targeting some of the hardest to reach communities in Nashville that we felt like weren't being served well. So our first school was in a part of Nashville, very just high poverty area. The vast majority of our students lived in government subsidized housing, really low academic marks. The surrounding public schools had all been in the bottom 10%, maybe even 5% in the state, right? So these are low performing schools. The kids there just didn't have many options. So we wanted to be a higher performing academic option. And we thought that our model could do that, right? And could yield better results. And indeed it did. Another school we started was in a place where we actually had lots of non-English speakers. So it was a huge Somali population. You had an Arabic speaking population, many Egyptian students. And then you had a Spanish speaking population, Central and South America, all in one school. That, again, that's really challenging for a district because often a school in a public school district, often the principal doesn't actually have hiring and firing capability. Those decisions often happen at the central office, whereas in a charter school, you can make those decisions kind of much more localized. So, you want to hire somebody who can speak Somali so that they're in the building all the time, right? It's sort of a no-brainer, but oftentimes in a big school district, sort of the bureaucracy gets in the way of some common sense, either some common sense practices or some innovative practices.
So it sounds like at least some of your schools were targeting some of the most disadvantaged communities in your area and that you had some success in terms of better results. Tell me a bit more about that. What were the metrics by which you saw success?
Yeah. So at those schools specifically, and I haven't been there in a few years, but I can tell you that almost immediately we saw those schools or students in those schools performing better than their peers at the zone schools that they would have attended, right? And so I would say that's kind of maybe the first metric you want to say, all right, at least this was some kind of value add. We wanted to see that increase over time. And so you want to see that academic proficiency, those numbers increase. So a higher percentage of your students, being rated as proficient and having mastered content on standardized tests. And so we administered both the state test and also another nationally norm referenced assessment. And so we tracked that pretty intensely. Another thing I think is really important is that when parents are making these decisions, and I gave a lot of school tours to families, rarely did I have a parent, almost never, frankly. I can think of one time that I had a parent ask me a really specific question about our English language arts curriculum. Now, parents definitely, though, want to know about our safety practices. They want to know about our discipline practices, right? You want to know, are my kids going to be safe? Are they going to be happy here? And so that alone, I mean, I think it's really easy to discount that because we think that those things should be a given in school. But when you talk to a lot of parents, they say, yeah, my student was just struggling at their former school because they were anxious all the time, because maybe the surrounding environment made them anxious, made them nervous, they were uncomfortable, whatever. So sometimes it's just the learning environment alone and that parent satisfaction those things are really important.
So yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up, because there's actually been a few, I think I saw one on PBS and on the New York Times in the last week or two, segments about the school choice movement and how in some districts, Orlando, for example, losing 25% of their public school enrollment, that this really taking off. And the two concerns that seem to motivate parents the most to get behind this movement and then to, use it, are educational standards and safety.
Yeah.
So let me ask you about safety, which you just mentioned was a major concern for the parents in your schools. What did you guys do to ensure safety in your schools, and what were the outcomes?
Yeah. So I think, I mean, as you know, unfortunately, there's only so much that any school can do in terms of guaranteeing safety from those who might do harm who are outside the school, right?
Sure.
So we know that's the case. But so I think when you think about school safety, or when I think about school safety, I think, all right, what's in your locus of control, and um, and you can control the environment inside the building, inside the sort of parameters of the school.
Right.
And so those are the things where I think you've seen, not all public school districts, but many public schools uh, kind of oscillate between overdoing certain like discipline practices. And what I'm thinking of there is, like, I've seen places in Tennessee where police have been called on second graders, and that's just
Right.
bananas to me. That's bananas.
Sure. Yeah.
Right. But you've seen that we're putting 65-pound kids in handcuffs. That's crazy. So that's overdoing it. And then sometimes the pendulum swings the other way, and you say, well, we're just going to be so laissez-faire that we hardly have any standards. And now you've got, we're unable to even take any actions when a student is just having a really bad day for whatever reason and is throwing desks and chairs around a classroom and endangering other students.
And do we do that? I mean, I don't really understand why we put 65-pound kids in handcuffs. I agree with you that seems crazy. And we don't do that in Canada, but it's not that hard to imagine what the misguided mindset is. We want to stop this behavior. We want to make an example. We want to scare the student, whatever it is.
Zero tolerance idea or something.
Yeah, the zero tolerance idea. So, but let's unpack the other side of the pendulum a little bit, right? So I know that some of the concerns about lenience arose from well-intentioned efforts to not have disparities in discipline. For example, for kids with disabilities, for kids from minority and socioeconomically disadvantaged backgrounds. Is that kind of the main driver, or is there something else that I'm missing too?
Yeah, I think that those things can be main drivers, but what I would say is sometimes those systems are built because they are predicated on a lack of trust and a lack of relationship between parents and the school team, the professionals in the building. And what I mean is, when I think about friends of mine, yeah, I mean in my personal life, for people that are my friends, people whom I trust, if they see my children doing something that's just unsafe or way out of line or something, I actually trust them to talk to my kids and say, "Hey, girls, what's going on? Like, what are you doing?" Right?
Yeah.
I sort of trust them to intervene, like be an adult. I think when the school family relationship is tight, there's that kind of trust. And so that is actually one of the things that I think you work on, and that I saw us work on at charter schools that I've been a part of, is you start from the very beginning. You start building that trust between the family and the team at the school, so that when there is a bad day, you've got some capital, some relationship capital, so that you can say, okay, little Matt, we need to come out of this classroom because you're not going to throw desks around and endanger the rest of the class, but let's have a talk about what's going on. And what you don't want is you don't want that to be the first time that you've spoken with little Matt's parents.
Right.
You want to have already built the relationship. And so I'll give you a real practical example of this, of how you build that trust. All of our students had a home visit from their from a teacher within the first month of school. So not a meet the teacher at school. We had that night too, but they had a home visit, right? So teachers were going to homes. And again, I mentioned that many of our kids, a vast majority of our kids, were in public housing, subsidized housing. That's really atypical. And I can tell you some teachers in the interview process would ask about that. Do you really do that? Are teachers really required to do home visits? We would say, yeah, they are. And I'll tell you what, Matt, it goes such a long way. Kids are so proud to when their teacher comes over, elementary kids especially, right? I don't know what it would look like at the high school level, but elementary school kids, they're so proud when their teacher comes over and they could say, hey, meet my my little brother, or come check out our dog. And now you've got a way to relate. And I just think that relationship building goes a really long way in creating a safe environment and a positive learning environment in the future.
That's really cool. So let's turn now to the other big concern that parents who support school choice talk about, which is educational standards. There's an economist you might have heard of named Roland Fryer, who does really cool research on charter schools and what correlates with some being more successful than others. And there's one study where he attributed up to half of the difference in charter schools effectiveness to 5 qualities, which were frequent teacher feedback, data-driven instruction, high dosage tutoring, and increased instructional time. Where the idea behind the last one was that, if you got, for example, the Harlem Children's Zone is something he talks about a lot, right? If you got a system of charter, if you got a charter school where you're dealing with kids who have serious disadvantage that are behind, you're not going to tell the rest of the kids in the city to take Thursday and Friday off. And the only way to catch up is to give them more time. And then the other 4 things, relate pretty clearly to no excuses, high standards and no excuses, right? And frequent teacher feedback absolutely can include firing bad teachers, as Jeffrey Canada, who runs the Harlem Children's Zone, has said in public talks with Roland. Does that map on well to what you see in your schools?
I think it most of that maps. I think the language, I will say, has changed a little bit from that no excuses model to one of high expectations. And maybe the parlance has changed, but I think a lot of the spirit remains the same. What I would say about kind of no excuses is that actually when we used to talk about no excuses, we really or often what that meant was that the adults in the building should not make excuses, right? And so it doesn't mean that you lack empathy for kids who are coming from a situation that, again, is really challenging, where there's these environmental factors at play. But I think too easily the adults in the room, in the building, in the district, made excuses for why subpar performance, either on their part or subpar results, are acceptable. And I think that's that mindset shift alone moves the needle. So I would agree with Fryer on that, and certainly with with Jeffrey Canada, who I got to meet last year, I think, and he's still he is still as fired up as ever about making sure that all kids have a chance to learn. And I do think it's like, you go into a lot of classrooms, and this is something that I think parents saw in COVID or during COVID, because they didn't go to classrooms, but all of a sudden so many kids were online. And, we were hearing what our kids were doing, maybe from the next room or maybe seeing it or whatever. And I think a lot of families just sort of said, like, what is happening? Like, this is, from a rigor standpoint, this feels like, um, the after work rec league softball game,
Right.
not rigorous. Maybe it's occasionally a fun time or whatever, but like nobody's going to the big leagues from that. And that's how a lot of school felt. A lot of people all of a sudden went like, wait, this is what my kids are doing for 7, 8 hours a day? Like, I would think that they'd be much farther ahead. How come if my kid is spending 7.5 hours, 8 hours a day doing this and still can't read, that's a problem. And so I think somebody's got to answer for that. And I think it's the adults.
Yeah. I mean, your point about no excuses for adults is so well taken. Karen Vates in her, the episode that she did talked about this too, about how, in Mississippi, when they decided that they could make kids repeat third grade if their reading wasn't good enough, that rallied the adults in the kid's life around making sure that didn't happen. And it happened in very, very few cases.
Yep. Yeah. Same thing in Tennessee. I mean, we had a similar law that passed. And, I think a lot of people were torn because they went, oh man, this sounds punitive. But as it turns out, very few kids were actually held back because what happened? All of a sudden, everybody upped their game and said, well, I guess we better do this. Right. And it's sort of a sink or swim moment for the system.
So let me ask you a couple questions in a similar vein of what I asked my last two guests, Karen Vates and Paul Bennett. You guys come in, you start these charter schools, you end up getting better results for some of these disadvantaged communities than previous schools had. Where did you guys find your ideas? Like you talked about, you talked about some of the things you did in terms of, accountability for the adults, high standards, safety, relationship building. If those things weren't happening in the same way to the same degree in the existing schools, where did you come up with the ideas to try those?
Yeah. So I worked at two different charter networks, and I know some of the ideas were taken from different places. I mean, at Rocket Ship, one of the actually the co-founders at Rocket Ship, Preston Smith and John Danner, came from really different backgrounds, and that helped a lot. So one was an educator, but he also had some roots in kind of the community organizing space. And so those relationships matter, right? That parent advocacy piece matters a whole lot. He was also a classroom educator. The other co-founder came from the tech space, Silicon Valley. He was really thinking, how do we make this whole production more efficient? How can we better leverage technology, right? So they were kind of borrowing some things from other domains that infused the school. I worked at another charter management organization called Lead Public Schools, and the founder there, this guy named Jeremy Kane, a friend, and he's now in Colorado. But he used to talk about the line, good poets borrow, great poets steal, and which in and of itself is a stolen line. And I can tell you that he went to lots of other schools around the country prior to opening Lead and sort of said, hey, what's working at Yes Prep schools in Texas? It seems like they've got something, right? What can we take from that model and use over here? He had been a teacher at a private school, a really well known kind of established private school in Nashville. So like, what are some things that we can learn from that system, right? Maybe on both on rigor, but on character building, and kind of infuse those. So I think you take these things, like there are lots of good ideas out there and lots of good practices out there. Plenty to borrow from. I do think one of the, if there's a bit of secret sauce, it's not trying to do too many things, right? You can't have a 15-point strategic plan. Like that's too many. So I do think you've got to like kind of narrow that that set of things that you're trying to do. Certainly not all at once, right? You can do a few things and execute them really, really well. That I think is also something that notoriously plagues many public schools is that because people often think about a public school building as such a hub, and it often is, maybe a community hub, whatever. Um, all of a sudden, the school can start taking on all these responsibilities that it's not equipped for, and so why is a school also a health clinic and also um, a food pantry and also a shelter? And that's a lot, and teachers are not trained to do all those things, and nor would I put all that on them, right? So I think there's a balance that we want to strike with yes, borrowing some things from the outside, but don't try to do it all at once.
So let me ask you my second follow-up question, which is more pointed. If the information about how to do this exists and can be found without much trouble, maybe with some effort, but without much difficulty by people who are motivated to find it,
Yeah.
why isn't everybody doing this?
Yeah. Well, I mean, you kind of answered it a little bit in your question. It can be found. It can be found without much effort. Some of these best practices, but can they be executed without much effort? That I think is some of the where some of the magic is. It's a little bit of it's like a people trying to lose weight. I mean, I suspect if we Googled right now, what's the best way to lose weight? There's probably, I don't know, 20 million different hits would probably pop up. At its core, it's not super complicated. And I say this, and I appreciate that I'm a skinny guy. So,
Sure.
we're doing this remotely, but I'm a skinny guy. But it's not super complicated. Uh, Caloric intake and exercise. Okay. Well, turns out most of us don't want to change what we eat.
Right. Standard and safety, right, are the calories and exercise of education.
Yeah, exactly. It turns out not many of us want to change what we eat, and not many of us want to exercise harder, right? And so, why are we surprised? So, what do? We look for these like tricks and tips. And again, I hope I don't and cause you to end up with a bunch of comments, about whatever, me not appreciating how challenging it is, what have you. But I do think that there's something to that, right? And so in the education space, like a school year is long and it's hard. A typical school year is around 180 days. 180 days of executing at a high level and sticking to and being disciplined to say yes to the right things, no to everything else. Like that takes a lot of discipline, and it is challenging.
So I hear that, and there's no equivalent of semaglutide for education, as far as I know. But I think maybe when I said effort, of course it takes tons of effort, but it's not necessarily more expensive, right? You're still able to offer high quality public education to some of the poorest kids in your area.
Yeah.
Right. And so there's no reason that other schools couldn't take the effort. And so I guess where I'm going with this is back to the question of school choice.
Yeah.
How much of school choice is the idea that we need to experiment and tailor because every kid learns differently and different communities have different needs? And how much of it is because in many cases our public school system isn't doing what it's supposed to be doing, that we need to have choice so that there's more experimentation, so that there's more market competition, so that in the areas where the public schools aren't doing what they're doing, there's a market feedback and an alternative?
Yeah, it's a great question. I appreciate you sort of pushing on this, continuing to press in on this, because I think you're right from a number of different angles. So I think that the yes, effort is a big deal. Can't stress that enough. And it's going to be, listen, being at a great school is hard work. Being at a poor performing school is also hard, right? So I think They can both be challenging environments. One of the differences, though, and this kind of gets to the market-based feedback loop. One of the differences I mentioned, we started a school in an area, a part of town, really low income, but where the majority of the competitor schools, if you will, were on the low performing list, bottom 10% in the state. And by the way, what that usually means is that single digit percentages of your kids are uh, performing math or reading on grade level. Single digit percentages.
That's
Yeah,
incredibly devastating.
it's devastating. Yeah,
That is, I may be borrowing from Roland Fryer or Jeffrey Canada and some talk of theirs, but to me, that is like, if that's not in the top, 2 or 3 social justice issues in the country, I don't know what is.
I'm totally agree. And here's part of the question, or here's maybe part of the answer to your question. You ask, well, why aren't other schools doing it? Well, we started those schools, whether I was at Lead, whether I was at Rocket Ship, other schools that I've seen start in my state and in my city and around the country. We started those schools because the the zoned public schools weren't transparent with the data, right? So a lot of parents, you would talk to them and you say, hey, did you know that your school is on the low performing list? And they say, no, I had no idea. My kid gets A's and B's. You say, really? They get A's and B's because they do not read on grade level. So what does that even mean? And what were the consequences for those schools? In some cases, nothing, right? They remain open. And so that is the real frustrating thing, I think. People like to talk about so-called accountability all the time. They say, well, public schools are accountable, and people ask the question, are charter schools accountable? Are private schools accountable? And let me tell you, usually what they mean by that is do they take the state standardized test? But if we're being honest about the word accountability, I sort of want to say, listen, you operated a school for 10 years that was in the bottom 5%. Where's the accountability in that? Right? That you have been allowed to persist unchanged. That is an injustice to the community. And so, you ask the question, like, why aren't other schools doing it? And I would sort of say, like, well, again, this might sound cynical, but what's their incentive to change, right? Because they can, it doesn't matter if you're a low performing school in most states, you can still churn through faculty because you're just going to get young faculty, young teachers in, because the ones with seniority get to go to a different school. So you're going to get young teachers. You're going to burn through them. You're going to pass kids along anyway. So they're not going to be your problem next year. And if they're disruptive, and many kids, by the way, are disruptive because they don't understand the content, right? Because they've been pushed on. And you still continue to have your budget like increase year over year. And so again, I don't mean to sound negative and cynical, but that is not an environment that that fosters either innovation or hard work or reform. And that's different in a charter school context or a private school context where you're sitting across the table. I never felt more accountability than when I was across the table from a parent who said, Mr. Mitchell, this is not working for us and we're going to go to a different school. Right? Because if they say that, like, I know, not only are they going to take their student with them, that's going to be disruptive in and of itself. That student is going to carry the funding with them. And that's going to, I'm going to have to redo those budgets. But also now that parent is going to tell the story to their network about why this school didn't work. Well, that's not good either, right? So that puts a lot of pressure on you, I think, to get it right or to do the best you can to get it right. And I don't think that a lot of schools feel that.
Yeah, market discipline, right? Is kind of what you're talking about. Okay. Tennessee is actually a really interesting area to be talking about this, because Tennessee is part of what education researchers call the Southern Surge, states that in the South that enacted reading reforms. Tennessee started theirs, I believe, in 2018, 2019 with curriculum, followed by the Reading 360 initiative a couple of years later.
Yep.
So, and as far as I understand, the outcomes of that have been pretty good. So how does that affect the school choice conversation in Tennessee?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, Tennessee has really benefited from a number of uh, public school, commissioners of education who have been pretty forward thinking. Um, I- I'll say, I'll say this: if you look at the states in this that are part of now this Southern Surge, if you were to compare them to say states in the Northeast or in the Upper Midwest, where what you're actually seeing is two things. You're seeing in southern states like Mississippi would be another one. I think you've spoken with somebody about Mississippi on this podcast.
Yep, Karen Bates.
Yeah. Mississippi has tremendous reading gains. I think Mississippi is now the reading NAEP scores. That's a National Assessment for Educational Progress. I think those are higher than in Minnesota. Right?
Yeah, I believe controlling for student disadvantage, they're number one now, and they were near the bottom,
right.
10 years ago or something.
Yeah, 10 years to 150 years ago, right? I mean, Mississippi, everybody in the South has always said, well, at least we're not Mississippi.
Right.
Now everybody is like, oh, what's Mississippi doing? They're getting something right. So there's been a couple things happening in these southern states, and that would include, as you mentioned, Tennessee, Mississippi. You've seen it in Arkansas, Florida, Georgia. All of these states are kind of moving multiple types of reforms at the same time. So you're seeing a lot of reading stuff happening, you're seeing some high dose tutoring stuff happening, and you're seeing this school choice or education freedom happening. And they're sort of happening in tandem. So that happened. So Mississippi working on, it's a more limited school choice program there, but they get that through. They get some of these reading changes through, and you start to agitate, within the entire education ecosystem. And I think it really benefits all kids. On the flip side, what you see in a state like New York is New York has taken a really hostile stance towards charter schools. There's no chance of a private choice program passing anytime soon. Been really hostile to that. And simultaneously, they said, you know what, we think we might just get rid of state-based standards in general and really water down the standards, right? So you tend to see these things move in tandem, because I really do think that it's not either or, right? Do I want families to have more options? Absolutely. And I want those options to be high quality options, right? So it's like we're not trying to create a system where you have lots of different options, but it's all junk. I mean, the whole point of that is for iron to sharpen iron, and we sort of all get stronger together. And a lot of that is happens with some public school reforms as well. So that's kind of what we've seen, is that they move in tandem. And Florida, it's been really, really positive there. You now have, you've got big districts. You mentioned Orlando earlier. Miami-Dade would be another. I think in Miami-Dade County, Florida, something like 70% of kids attend a school that's not their zone school, which is pretty amazing. So tremendous amount of choice, but the kids who stay in their public schools, because of their studies have shown, I think it's one out of, now I'll forget the think tank it's out of. I think it's Chingos, Urban Institute, I believe, shows that the kids who have in public schools who have greater exposure to competition actually attend college at a higher rate. right? That's pretty interesting. So the
Yeah,
school that they're left in seems to adapt a little bit and is responding some to those competitive sort of market forces.
iron sharpens iron, market discipline. So let me ask, your anecdote about Miami-Dade and 70%, I think you said, of students attending out of out of zone schools brings up what I think of as the strongest argument that I've heard against school choice, which is that one of the benefits of public schooling is integration. That you've got kids from different backgrounds in your neighborhood growing up together and learning together in their school. And that has a benefit to the larger social cohesion. Whereas, in the extreme of school choice, where people end up self-segregating, maybe along axes of interest or, axis of social political difference, you get less of that and you get more societal fragmentation. What's your take on that or response to that?
Yeah, a couple different ways to think about this, I think, or a couple maybe ways to respond to it. The first is that I think certainly in the United States, um, folks who are like public school, um, I don't mean this as a pejorative, but public school zealots, I think overstate the integration effects of public schools. Neighborhoods are segregated,
Right. So
right?
this is actually, I was going to ask you as a follow-up. Are they overstating it because neighborhoods are segregated and so there's not much integration going on, or are they overstating the benefits of integration were it to occur?
Yeah, I would say the former for sure. I think they're overstating how integrated many neighborhoods are, right? I mean, again, something that's really interesting about the South, but it's not unique to the South. A lot of it started in places like Long Island with Levitt towns and so forth, where you had these race-based redlining. Well, those were real estate decisions. Well, when you overlay many public school district maps on top of those redlined real estate districts, they are nearly identical, right? That stuff persists in a whole lot of cities. And so, if you live in a 99% African American neighborhood, well, um, there's nothing especially diverse in the truest sense of the word about going to your neighborhood school, right? You're not going to see any racial ethnic diversity there. Um, so so people can overstate that. That being said, there's some really interesting work that came out of the University of Arkansas. A guy, Dr. Patrick Wolf, has done some work on civics, um, and civic education and school choice, but not just civic education, but sort of, um, um, I guess, civic engagement. Yeah, it's really civic engagement, and he's got a couple different theories for why families who participate in choice programs actually seem to show higher levels of civic engagement. So I think one thing to keep in mind is that with a choice program, people actually do get to mix a little bit more, right? Because now you can go to a school that's not in your neighborhood. And I realize that's less convenient. My kids go to a school that's not in our neighborhood. It is less convenient, but they are around kids who are more different than they would have been otherwise because we drive them right. So, because now there's kids coming from a bunch of different zip codes, 10 different zip codes. So there's a mixture happening there. So that's one thing that Dr. Wolf would point to. Another thing that I think is pretty interesting, especially given your podcast and your interest, is that when families start to make decisions about education and they start to employ that agency, it's like this. It's the first domino. It's often the first domino in what is now a succession of them becoming more civically engaged, right? If you're at a school, think about the opposite. If you're at a school where you take a complaint to the vice principal or to the principal and nobody listens to you, well, what are you likely to do? You're likely to just stop engaging, just generally, right? And you go, well, fine, they're not listening to me. I'm just, whatever. It's not going to change. Versus Dr. Wolf would say, um, families who have said, you know what, this wasn't working for me. Our family is going to take advantage of this choice program. We're going to go to a different school. Now you start to feel empowered and you go, hey, what else can I do? Actually, that was really empowering. I can start to do some other things too. And he thinks that it leads to other types of civic engagement. And I think um, that's a really interesting sort of, hypothesis. The last thing I'll say is there is a link, I believe, between quality education and our ability to appreciate others who are unlike ourselves, right? So, um, if you go through 13 years of formal education and you're not challenged academically, and your perspective never broadens because you can't access text, right? Because you can't, you don't read well, you're not comfortable with it, you don't know what the world is like beyond your little neighborhood, right? I actually think you're going to have a much harder time engaging with, the melting pot that is the United States, versus if you are able to engage with others. I mean, that's what now I sound like the guy from Reading Rainbow or something, but that's sort of what reading does. You're engaging with people from other centuries, from other parts of the country, other parts of the world, and your perspective is broadening in scope. That happens with quality education, and so I'd much I think quality education helps lead to a more integrated and intermingled society.
By the way, your argument that if I had to strip it down, that education quality breeds cosmopolitanism, breeds more inclusivity, as far as I understand, there's actually lots of empirical support for that hypothesis. On the subject of integrating, I want to take a hard left turn as we end.
Let's do it.
And ask you about the Come Together Music Project, which is a new project you have combining music and reducing political polarization.
Yeah.
Tell me about it.
Yeah. Thanks, Matt. So Come Together Music Project is a project where we use music to bring diverse guests together to show how music can deepen existing relationships, create new ones, and build bridges. And I'm in Nashville, which is Music City. Um, or, I think a lot of people would acknowledge pretty readily that there's just a power in music, right? It's really sticky, meaning it helps us recall memories. There's a quote I love that says that every memory has a soundtrack all its own. And really started this project a few years ago, but it recently launched as a nonprofit organization to do just this, to be able to have conversations with people who maybe we've known for a while and we want to go deeper, or maybe people that we just met. And I think that there is a temptation for like policy wonks like me. We want to jump right in and start talking about policy, right? People want to jump right in and they want to start talking about the Second Amendment, or they want to start or whatever the contentious thing of the day is, this tax policy or whatever. And that's fine. And I'm down with that. But it seemed to me in recent years that we'd lost a lot of the ability, frankly, to just sit down and speak with each other generally. And if we can't humanize one another, I don't think we can get to those other more contentious topics, right? There's some research, I think it was out of Pew, that showed that more than half of all millennials were considering skipping Thanksgiving because they didn't want to talk about politics, right? So, and that's really recent. That's only in the past few years. It's crazy that we think we can't even be in the same house with our family because we don't know how to relate to them and talk to them. And so, Come Together Music is really meant to be a tool so that we can, in some ways, like get reacquainted. And it's always a lot of fun. So we ask people questions. I ask people questions, and they respond to them with songs. So I might ask you, hey, what's a a song that reminds you of where you grew up in Canada. And I bet without a whole lot of effort, you could come up with something. And then we'll listen to it. And then, so it's part storytelling, part like listening party.
Super cool. Super cool. What's one example of a particularly interesting conversation that you've had as part of that project?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's good. So one conversation we had was here with, actually, we did it in the studio with two guests who are both based in Nashville. We did it with a guy named Justin Owen. He is the CEO of the Beacon Center, which is the right of center, public policy think tank in Tennessee. And then the counterpart for that episode was Judge Sheila Calloway, and she is the juvenile court judge, the top juvenile court judge for the city of Nashville, the county of Davidson. And they had never met one another. They are politically pretty different from one another. And I asked them about a song that reminds them of where they grew up. I asked them about a song that they might listen to after a hard day at work. And then the last song, because they're both lawyers, I said, hey, what's a song that you associate with justice? And we got some great songs from Sheila. Let's see. She came up with a song. It was a sort of a soul song from the 60s where the chorus is, the world won't get no better if we just let it be. We've got to change it, you and me. And then Justin, a song that reminded him of justice, he picked Fight for Your Right to Party by the Beastie Boys.
Fascinating.
And it was great. And it was a great moment. Both of them were great songs, but they picked it and they picked these songs and found that they had a whole lot in common, right? Because they started talking about how they both felt that people needed to be more empowered to kind of direct their own lives and not lean too much on the government. I don't think either one of them expected the other to say that. And I can guarantee that we never would have come to that point if we had tried to just launch, from the jump and say, hey, what's your philosophy of, individual liberty or something, right? That we never would have gotten to that point. But by the time we were done, they're exchanging cell phone numbers, and it was a great time.
Well, that's awesome. I really enjoyed this episode. I think it's an example of, how you've tackled some thorny issues and made real progress on them, both in education and getting people to come together. Shaka Mitchell, thanks so much for coming on Grounded Not Divided.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Grounded Not Divided. If you want to hear more episodes like this, be sure to subscribe for free on Apple, Spotify, or on the Guided Civic Revival Substack. You can also email us feedback at matt.burgess@uwyo.edu. See you next time.